Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. In this video, we have a whole bunch of news to go over for both Squadron 42 and Star Citizen this week. Now, for Squadron 42, there's going to be some official news in there, like the buyback news, but we also have some speculation and talk about the release announcement for this game. Because truthfully, if you've kind of been watching everything a little bit here, it seems like there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes, and quite frankly, I think we are a lot closer to a release announcement than we might have realized. Now, for Star Citizen, we do have 4.8 news. There is going to be a playtest or a PTU release for 4.8, hopefully tomorrow. Now, we're going to be discussing that a little bit more here in the video, but get excited because it looks like we're really close to getting our first look at tactical strike groups, which I'm super pumped to see. And then on top of that, we of course have some pretty nice crafting news. And then there's also a few things here and there regarding the battle cruiser, the Anvil Odin. Now, before we get into it, if you are enjoying the content and you do want to stick around for more, feel free to subscribe. I do have channel memberships open if you wanted to go the extra mile, and feel free to join the community Discord. I have a link for that down below, and I would love to have you there. Outside of that, let's get into a bunch of news for both Squadron 42 and Star Citizen. All right, now getting into the 4.8 news, it looks like we have an Evo patch happening this weekend. It was supposed to be tonight on Friday, the time of recording, but that has since been pushed back, given the fact that it seems like they just need a little bit longer in QA. Outside of that, though, we most likely will have it this weekend unless some random blocker shows up. Now, keep in mind this is an Evo playtest, so only Evo can actually access it, and there won't be any official photo and video shown off from the patch. Now, that being said, there will of course be patch notes. There will be creators and players talking about the actual patch when they get their hands on it. And then, of course, just like there normally is, we will also get data mines, as this is probably the biggest patch for at least the first half of the year. Now, keep in mind for this first 4.8 release, it's most likely not going to have all of the big names for the patch. So, tactical strike groups most likely won't make it initially. It might, but I'm not entirely sold on that idea. As well as, some of the bigger features, especially some that might not have been announced yet, like item recovery tier 1 and maybe even FPS radar and scanning. Those types of features, if they do make it to 4.8, are probably not going to get tested initially, and we'll most likely be seeing things like the refueling updates as well as ship rearm and refuel. So honestly, it might not be the craziest build, but you can almost guarantee, again, with like data mines and all that jazz, we're still going to get some really nice information out of that. Now, we'll discuss some Invictus news and some speculation about all that jazz a little bit here, but just keep in mind that Evo test will be happening very soon, and it's probably going to get into the really exciting 4.8 PTU cycle, which should lead up to a release just before the first half of May. Now, we also do have a little bit of 4.8 news from the recent crafting and inventory SCL. I will, add a small disclaimer. I know, a lot of people have been talking about this SCL and all that jazz because, of course, they talked about a lot of things. But there, quite frankly, was a lot of information from that SCL that was already talked about in the crafting guide, just like the future section that they had at the bottom. So we'll try and keep a lot of the repeated information to a minimum, but keep in mind there was, in fact, a lot of repeated information from that crafting guide. Now, getting into the main information from the SCL that is in regard to 4.8. The first initial drop here is in regards to crafting, and that's the fact that we're going to be able to craft ship components in 4.8. Not all of them. They specifically said life support will not be in there, but other ship components as well as ship weapons, tractor beam modules, things like that will be craftable in 4.8. And I think that's really nice and exciting. It's, mainly exciting because they're still expanding on the system. It's not like it's being forgotten like a lot of features have in the past. And I'm really happy to hear this because it really seems like they want to keep going with crafting in every single patch rather than, again, just forgetting about it. So that will be the first initial big update to crafting that we get. And then on top of that, they did say that backpacks will be craftable in 4.8 as well. They won't have any stat differences as far as we're concerned for this initial release, but in the future, there will be some stat advantages for crafting backpacks. Right now, it's really just for the sake of being able to actually craft your own backpack. Now, getting into some crafting information that's not for 4.8, but just for the future in general, one thing that I think was interesting was getting items that are bigger than the fabrication machine crafted. It seems like they're just going to kind of put this into local storage wherever that crafting machine is at. So I think this is a completely reasonable solution for that issue. Just currently. I wouldn't be surprised if in the future, since we're going to have different like hangar upgrades and modifications, I really wouldn't be surprised if they had like a massive fabrication like freight elevator machine that they have in the future. That's total speculation, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was kind of what they went for. And then outside of that, of course, they're gonna have like huge modules for building like ships whenever we have base building and all that jazz. So this is already something that they have planned for the future. But kind of sending things to local storage will be the temporary solution until that happens. Now, they also did, of course, talk about like resource distribution, getting it where it feels like it's rewarding to go out and go mining and whatnot without it feeling like just like a complete burnout session because you can't find anything of higher quality. But they were very, strict on the fact that they really want finding high quality resources to be a really exciting thing that happens, like not too frequently, but certainly, frequently enough where it doesn't feel impossible. And I totally understand that. That'll absolutely take some balancing, but I totally get what they're going for and I fully support that idea. Now, on top of that, of course, they want you to be able to actually trade with other players these higher quality resources. So you're not just locked behind having to go find them yourself. But of course, when we get player trading in, that'll be a huge way of gaining access to some of these higher quality materials. On top of that, one thing that they did talk about was the idea of actually merging different materials. So, or not different materials, but multiple qualities of materials. So, if you have like aluminum and you just have a ton of different types of quality for this, you can merge them all into an average amount of quality. So, you don't have a bunch of space being taken up by like tons of SCU of aluminum of just different quality rates. I think this is totally reasonable. They already announced this with that crafting guide, but I think it's absolutely worth pointing out again because it's going to help a lot with some of the clutter. On top of that, this kind of goes into some of the inventory stuff, but they did talk about using like almost a folder style of inventory. So if you have a resource, you can open up the folder for that resource, and that will give you access to all the individual qualities of that resource. I think that is an absolutely amazing idea of making the UI a little bit more friendly, and it'll probably be something that people appreciate a lot more whenever we actually get it in our hands. Now, that kind of segues us into some of the inventory stuff. Now, when it comes to actual 4.8 news for the inventory, the main thing we're getting is larger icons. So they're going to make it where it's 4 items per row, and that'll generally make it easier to see what's in those items or what's in those little boxes, the picture. And then in general, they said there's going to be better readability. I think across the board, this is going to be a nice initial change, but there is actually going to be some more customization that we're going to have later down the line. Most of these changes are going to be in regards to, once again, like readability and scalability. So you're going to have, again, different scaling for the icons all the way down to text. So if you just don't care to have an image at all, you can just have text in your inventory. Not sure how that'll look, but I certainly appreciate that they're going to have that option. And then something I'm really excited about is the ability to actually adjust the like window size of the inventory. So perhaps if you wanted to just kind of fill your whole screen with your inventory to make it a little bit easier, potentially that's something you'll be able to do in the future. I'm not set on this being something we'll be able to see anytime soon, like alongside that and like the folder style of grouping for materials, like things like that. I don't expect to see soon, but it's really nice to hear that that is confirmed for the future because I certainly think that'll be a nice quality of life update. Just off to the side, but they did mention out for inventory, they did want to make it quicker and just look a little bit cleaner. That there's not much to say on that. That's just something that we need in general. And I think a lot of people are also just wondering, like, hey, what's going on with the back end of the inventory? Of course, that's not really up to the designers of the inventory. So I'm not so worried about the fact that they didn't talk about that much. But I can only assume that the next time we see Benoit or anything like that, that we're certainly going to hear about updates regarding the back end of the inventory system. Because don't get me wrong, it's pretty frustrating whenever we're dealing with some of those older bugs that we used to deal with the older inventory. Now, moving on from inventory and crafting, although those are very exciting, there was a pretty big topic that was unfortunately a little disappointing for those that are really excited for it, and that is player to player trading. Now, this was mentioned a lot in this SCL, and that's because it's a really important part of Star Citizen, and it's something that's very important to the developers and designers that were on the SCL. The problem is that when they were actually asked about it, it felt like everything got a little too quiet and the response was a little bit too vague. And I think we know exactly why that is, and that's because player to player trading is most likely not going to release like at all this year. Now, the consensus is that the social systems that are being worked on currently are going to be laying the groundwork for this system. That makes total sense. In order to get a player to player trading system, we're going to need a whole like custom UI that we definitely don't have in the game currently. And in order to do that, they're probably going to need to build off of the new social systems that are being worked on right now. Now, something I thought was really cool for player to player trading is they talked about the outline of kind of how you would do it, which I think is a big question for a lot of people. It seems like for the initial release, whenever we do get that, it'll most likely use, some of the trading areas of, landing zones, space stations, just kind of public social locations. This totally makes sense and I think is reasonable. It'll most likely, I would think, involve you storing whatever you want to trade in your local inventory, going to that specific trading location and then trading with said player or maybe even organization. Regardless, I do like the outline for that initial implementation, and it does seem like the long term goal will be to have player to player trading be hosted individually at player bases. So I love that idea, but of course that is locked behind base building, which, even though I have my hopium and thoughts about that, I certainly think is still a little bit of a ways away. Regardless, it does seem like player to player trading will be one of the most important parts of the market and the economy for this game. Star Sim will be actively following the trades that are done between players, and I think that's a really cool idea. And in general, I think player to player trading is something they're going to focus on super heavily once they get the tech and the foundation to actually implement it. But until then, it's probably going to be pretty difficult to exchange goods between players, unfortunately. Now, some really cool stuff in regards to blueprints. Now, there's not much to say that hasn't already been said, but something they talked about again was the physical data pads. Now, I didn't really, see the vision nearly as much initially, just in terms of like gameplay, but I can totally see the idea of having like a boss fight where you have like a heavily suited up dude that you can quite literally see like having a blueprint hanging from his belt or something like that, that is kind of your main objective for eliminating that boss. I love the idea of having some things like that to kind of indicate that that person is a special target. It's something you really want to focus on because, of course, they have access to that blueprint. I love the idea of just having those physical data sets or data pads to get these blueprints from. I think it'll make exploring locations really interesting because instead of just finishing a mission and getting a blueprint, which is totally cool, I love the idea of actually, physically, tangibly picking one up and just being excited that you found a certain blueprint. That seems like a really cool idea. Everything else is also kind of just repeat news. They talked a little bit about like you'll be able to craft, attachments for weapons, which I think is really cool. And you will also be able to detach skins from weapons, or they're gonna detach it in just like in general. So paints will be physicalized and you won't necessarily have to have like a million different blueprints of one specific item. You'll just have that one item and you can apply different paints and tints to those items, which I think is of course a much more reasonable system than what we currently have. Outside of that, there wasn't a ton more to go off of in the SCL. They did talk a little bit about degradation, but I really think that this is just something that we'll see later on whenever we get it in. It'll just take a lot of balancing. Really, all they talked about was making sure that it doesn't feel like a chore, but it also is important because you don't want players crafting something once and then never again. So I think it's totally reasonable. It's just going to take some time. Now, get out of the way, I wanted to get in some of the more exciting stuff for this video. Of course, the crafting stuff is really cool, but I really do want to talk about Squadron 42 and Invictus and all that jazz. So, initially for Squadron 42, of course, they talked about the buyback situation. This is something players have noticed, I think, over the past week or so, and it's something that they initially didn't really speak about, but we did get a post from Xylo just the other day talking a little bit more about this. Now, the whole post really is just confirming what we already knew. So I'm not going to go through it. It really is just pointing out they don't want to deal with like gray market and people selling their Squadron 42 copies, anything like that. for a profit, or I think in general they just don't want to have anyone selling their game whenever they initially release it. That makes total sense. I think it's very realistic and understandable for them to do this right now. But I do think that it's notable that they are doing it, especially at the bottom here when they say, as preparations for Squadron 42's release continue in the background, we'll keep taking a closer look at systems like buybacks and share more as we have updates. Again, I think this is totally reasonable. I know some people might be upset about it, but it is what it is. I think CIG really is just, realistically preparing for a release, which by itself is very exciting. And there's some other things to kind of go alongside that. Now, there was some talk of the website being updated for Squadron 42, and I can confirm that clicking on the website during that time frame gave us access to basically nothing other than like the title, and then it showed like launching 2026 at the bottom. Everything else was blank. It updated shortly after that, a couple hours after. Potentially, this is some website updates for some sort of announcement. Regardless, I don't want to look too deep into it as there wasn't anything crazy that actually changed with the website. But it is worth noting that that happened very shortly after this whole buyback situation was also occurring. So it definitely feels like something's happening. On top of that, we have the Level Up Expo, which is happening almost exactly 1 week from now. Now, I don't want to get too excited for this one because, truthfully, I don't necessarily see it as the best place to announce anything squadron related or really anything related. But it certainly could have some news there. So that will be happening in 1 week. There will be like an actual show floor, area for CIG and Star Citizen, but there will also be a Bar Citizen. So I can almost guarantee there will be some news to come out of this, but I'm definitely up in the air as to whether or not we'll get any like crazy, insane confirmations from this event. Now, I would love to hear down below if you have any information about the Level Up Expo that is a little bit more insightful. Truthfully, I don't know what it's all about quite yet. It's really the first time I've ever heard about it was that CIG was going to it, so I'm curious as to what that really will look like. But looking at a more realistic time frame for a squadron release announcement, I honestly think Invictus is looking a lot more appealing than it was before. Now, I really think if you were to ask me a month ago if I thought this was going to happen, I really wouldn't think so. But with the Squadron 42 like buyback situation, as well as the, of course, like the website going down for updates, or at least being like empty for potential updates, I really think that there is, a possibility that they're ramping up for an announcement, and it only makes sense that that announcement time would be the Invictus event. It makes total sense if we're being quite frank. I mean, Invictus is all about recruiting into the UEE, and Squadron 42's marketing has always been about recruiting into the UEE. So, to be honest here, it lines up perfectly. It's just really a matter of if CIG actually wants to do it. And given the fact that, again, we're seeing these small little signs here and there, I really think that the chances have gone up exponentially since the beginning of the year. Now, I don't want to drive this into the ground too hard because, again, this is speculation, but I do want to at least throw the idea out there, as many others have been as well, simply because the stars are aligning a little too much for this to kind of be just some random coincidence. So I don't want to talk about it much more than that, at least on the squadron side of things. But I would just go ahead and keep your eye out for a potential announcement there, and just keep your eye out in general, because I think that if it really is the case, we'll most likely get super, super small hints and little things happening here and there that might kind of push towards that announcement. Getting away from that speculation, let's get into some of the Invictus speculation, or not even as much speculation. So, we know that the battle cruiser is the Anvil Odin. I know this is something that people, wanted to, maybe debate a little bit before the SCL, but after the SCL, it was quite literally confirmed by Jared that the Anvil Odin is the battle cruiser, which is going to be being announced at Invictus this year. Now, when it comes to what the battle cruiser is, we don't know. I mean, we really don't know. But I do think that it is kind of funny that the battle cruiser is named the Anvil Odin, which, if you remember correctly, is the name of the system that most of Squadron 42 takes place in, which is the Odin system. Now, before we get back on the Squadron 42 train of speculation, I'm just going to leave you with that info because, truthfully, it speaks for itself. If you think it's a coincidence, totally understandable, but quite frankly, I don't know. The stars are aligning, and that's all I can say there. Now, talking about the actual Odin itself, which we don't have really any information on, but we can kind of go through how it was announced and just talk about it a little bit here. So we know that the Anvil portfolio page was updated with a little section that said it is believed that Anvil will be revealing a brand new ship in 2956 that industry insiders have described as the future of modern naval warfare, which is obviously a very cool statement to see. I think we all kind of expected that though. And then Odin comes from the Galactopedia. That is just a release that they had almost at the exact same time as they updated the portfolio page, which only confirms that the fact that this ship will be called the Anvil Odin. Now, we know nothing about this. I'm pumped to see what an Anvil capital ship looks like, especially one that is supposed to be a battle cruiser. But only time will tell, and I think it will really, really be a cool Invictus because of this thing. Now, getting into the idea of when this thing could actually release, I have literally no idea. Now, I can pretty confidently say they're probably going to put this thing into pre production or like, start to get it into production probably pretty quickly. Mainly because it's going to take a shit ton of time to make a ship of this size, assuming it's probably going to be one of, if not the biggest ships in the game. So I can only assume they're going to start production very soon. It's just, it's going to take forever. So I would fully expect maybe like a super late or maybe early 2028 release, super late 2027, maybe early 2028 if we're being like incredibly generous here. But I assume this will be a before 1.0 thing, but I wouldn't even be surprised if they release this with 1.0. Regardless, I think we're all pumped to just see what this thing is. It's going to be badass and it's going to be awesome to see it, even if it costs like a bagillion dollars, which regardless, I think it will still be purchased a shit ton by players. Now, in terms of Invictus ship news, this is something that we're already, of course, getting glimpses at. The sneak peek of this week, I'm just going to put it up on the screen now. It's the command module seat. Nothing too exciting. I will say the quote for it is kind of odd. I don't know why they put it like this, but they said, big things come on small packages. So maybe there's more to the command module than we initially thought, but there's not much else to say there. What I will say for Invictus news, though, is we are getting the Bars Citizen China SCL in 2 weeks or about 2.5 weeks on May 2nd. If they actually release that, to their YouTube channel on the same day, that would be nice. But I assume we'll probably have to watch it through like someone recording it on their phones, at least for the first initial watch, if you want to see it that day. But this will be the first SCO where we get, really exciting ship information. This is typically where they start to talk about and announce some things that are more exciting in terms of ship news. So just keep an eye out for that. That'll most likely discuss not only Invictus related ships, but potentially even IAE ships or just big things that they have planned for the future. I really have my fingers crossed for news about escape pods. I did actually put a question about escape pods like I would. I doubt they're going to actually pick it, but I'm crossing my fingers. But also things like the Legionnaire, I would love for them to talk about that because with this whole command module stuff, I would love to know what's kind of going on with that ship potentially. And then, of course, any other ship that hasn't been talked about in a while. I think that's the SCL you want to look out for because they typically go on and talk about the more exciting things around these big events. So just keep that in mind. Now, what I will say is that, of course, for Invictus, we are probably going to get news sooner than later because of things like data mines and just probably teases from CIG. Of course, at this point, this is like their third time teasing the command module. Maybe something bigger than we realize is happening with the command module, or they're just constantly teasing it because they don't really want to tease anything else just yet. I really do think we will be seeing a new Origin ship, whether that's a generalist or something else. I don't know, but I do think that there's definitely a possibility. And then I also certainly think that we're going to see the new refueling ship of some kind at Invictus, which I know some people certainly could be very excited for. There's a lot that's happening around the corner here, and I'm just really excited to go into this with everyone and just get into the joy of Star Citizen hype. Because even though it's really just like a store page event, I really do love going through the expo halls and looking through some of these new ships, even if I don't plan on buying any of them. Which, by the way, if you are like me and you do not buy ships really with real money at all, even though this is not necessarily the event for people like us, it's certainly a really fun time to just get excited about the game and kind of where they're headed with some of these ships. And I'm certainly looking forward to doing that this May. So please leave your thoughts down below for everything we talked about in this video, but I would love to hear your thoughts on things like the Battle Cruiser, Invictus, and Squadron 42. Those are obviously the highlights of what's going on right now, and while I think there's certainly going to be some bigger things that happen over the next couple weeks, we're just going to have to wait and see what that is. Outside of that, I want to say thank you so much for watching and being here till the end. I know this is a bit of a longer video and I'm kind of all over the place here, but I really am excited for what's going on right now. And I'm currently in the middle of I'm about to go and move to another place, so it's gonna be probably pretty hard to get videos out, but I promise you, I will get them done. It just might take a little longer than I'd like, and you might have longer videos like this one. So thank you so much for being here and for the continued support. It means the world to me. Again, thank you so much for 3,000 subscribers. It is a huge milestone for me, and I cannot get there at all without you, the people that actually watch and view and comment on these videos, because it really does mean a lot to me, all the support that you guys do bring to the table. Outside of that, though, thank you so much for being here and watching till the end. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you in the next video.